And she found that when they were exposed to fluoridated water in their 6th, 7th, and 8th years, they had a 5 to 7-fold increased risk of developing osteosarcoma by the age of 20. Very important study. However, nobody heard about it. Her boss at Harvard, Chester Douglas, who is a consultant for Colgate and also a well-known promoter of fluoridation, who produced that study in 1991, which said that actually fluoridation is protective against osteosarcoma. So it's interesting that the National Institute of Health chose this man to finance studies on osteosarcoma. For the next 3 years after Bassin had successfully defended her doctoral thesis, he had 3 opportunities, Douglas, to tell his peers, tell the scientific community, to tell the public that this finding had been found. Now, why was it important to do that? Well, osteosarcoma is frequently fatal. And so now you've got evidence that fluoridation may actually be killing people. Not a lot of people. It may be just a half a dozen in the whole country. But nonetheless, if Bassin was correct, fluoridation is killing a few people. And how many teeth would you have to save to justify one child dying of osteosarcoma? Well, Chester Douglas in 2002, after 1 year after this discovery, went to England. He talked to the British Fluoridation Society, which promotes fluoridation, and said, my work found no association between fluoridation and osteosarcoma. Oops-a-daisy, somehow forgot to mention his graduate students' work who had found the very opposite. And when he wrote to the National Research Council, who asked him about his work, again he said, my work shows no relationship between fluoridation and osteosarcoma. This time he put Bassin's thesis as a footnote, so he's covering his rear end, except he didn't say that her thesis contradicted what he was telling the NRC. Then, in 2006, Elise Bassin published her thesis with 3 other co-authors in Cancer Causes and Control, peer-reviewed, published study. In the same issue of the journal, Chester Douglas put in a letter discounting her study, saying his largest study, eventually, his largest study would discount her findings and not to take them too seriously. I've never heard of a professor doing that to a graduate student before, but be that as it may, he promised the study for the summer of 2006, and we are still waiting. It's now the fall of 2010, nearly the winter of 2010. We are still waiting for Chester Goddo Douglas. We are waiting for Goddo. We are waiting for this study. Meanwhile, the promoters of fluoridation in Australia, in New Zealand, in England, in Canada, in the United States, in Israel, are using this promise of a study to negate concern about osteosarcoma. So much for their notion of what good science involves. You can use a promise in a letter to offset a well-designed, peer-reviewed and published study.
And the US Public Health Service, incidentally, before any of these trials have been completed, and before there were any significant health studies published, endorsed fluoridation in 1950. So it wasn't scientific then. They didn't have the science. So obviously there were political forces operating then. And after the US Public Health Service endorsed, then in came the American Dental Association, American Public Health Association, eventually the American Medical Association. They all endorsed fluoridation, again, without the science on the table. Now, we mentioned some of the other things that happened in American history about this time. And Chris Bryson has written a brilliant book called The Fluoride Deception. And if you go to our webpage, you can see a 28-minute interview I have with Chris. It's very powerful. And basically, Chris's thesis, and he documents it very well, is there was collusion between the US Public Health Service and the Fluoride Lawyers Association. Now, there's something else happened that Chris didn't talk about. In 1949, the sugar lobby the Sugar Research Foundation said, we need to find a way to reduce tooth decay without reducing sugar consumption. And then they poured millions of dollars into nutrition departments in Harvard, Michigan, and other places. And the professors, one in particular, Dr. Fred Stair, did yeoman service for this food lobby, extolling the virtues of sugar, that Coca-Cola was a nutritious drink. This is coming from Harvard now. Coca-Cola is a nutritious drink, and fluoridation was obviously the best thing since sliced bread. Not only good for children, but good for adults, protecting their bones. So that was sugar money. Also at the same time, you had the Manhattan Project, where a huge amount of fluoride is being used to develop the atomic bomb. But also there were releases, and they too were worried about lawsuits.
A very important factor here is that one of the emotive arguments used by promoters for fluoridation is to convince the public that you have to fluoridate for equity. We have to fluoridate so that we can get fluoridated water to everybody. The high income, middle income, low income, particularly low income. So they make a point that low income children from low income families really need fluoridated water. The trouble with this is actually a pernicious document. It's as far from equity as you could possibly get. Because if you force low income families to have it or give it to low income families, they can't afford to avoid it. They can't afford bottled water for drinking and cooking. They can't afford reverse osmosis, and so they are trapped. So the very people that you think you're being nice to, you're trapping. The second thing is, we know very clearly from studies done in India and China, it's children with poor diet that are most vulnerable to fluoride's toxic effects. Children who have low vitamin intake, low minerals like very much calcium, magnesium, and low protein are very much more vulnerable to fluoride's toxic effects than children with a good diet. And unfortunately, you're more likely to find poor diets in low-income areas. Now, on top of that, there's another factor, and this particularly affects black children. Black children have a higher incidence of lactose intolerance. They can't drink milk or eat dairy products, which means that they have a low calcium intake. And we know, again from Indian studies, that calcium is, to a certain extent, a large excess of calcium is protective, to a certain extent, from fluoride's toxicity. So black children do not have, many black children do not have that benefit. And one of the places that this has shown up from the very beginning is that the dental fluorosis rates in black children is higher than in white children. And the latest report from the Centers for Disease Control confirms that fact. In fact, one of the highest cities in the United States for dental fluorosis is Atlanta, Georgia, which has a very high percentage of black families.
The Bryson thesis is that this whole business of fluoridation was a way of changing the image of the worst air pollutant in those days to this nice benign substance that was safe enough to put on your teeth and put in your children's water and so on. And they had the help of the most brilliant public relations expert of all time, Edward Bernays, the father of public relations and propaganda in the United States. Absolutely incredible. Engineering consent began with Edward Bernays. So there are some of the things that were operating. And now I want to throw you a little tidbit, and then I'll give it to Ray. A little tidbit. One of the research teams that found that fluoride caused dental fluorosis was H.V. Churchill. He was the chief chemist for Alcoa, who produced a massive load of fluoride pollution. Okay, so then they found out that fluoride in water caused dental fluorosis. He phoned privately dentists in some of the towns, in one in particular, Messina, which had Alcoa plants, and found out that children there had dental fluorosis, even though the fluoride in the water was extremely low. Now, I'm only throwing this out. This is pure speculation, pure speculation. There's nothing worse for industry than to have a telltale biomarker of one of its toxic pollutants. In lawsuits, it could be devastating. If you, the lawyer, can show that this family, the children have dental fluorosis, then you look around to see where the fluoride could come from, and if you're the only plant in the area that's producing fluoride pollution, you're in trouble. And you're in even deep trouble if someone can show something even worse than dental fluorosis, which I think they all suspected, by the way. Now, this is the speculation. And please, don't make too much of this. But it is nasty, but rational for Alcoa and other fluoride pollutants to want to fluoridate the water to give as many children dental fluorosis as they possibly could, so that nobody could identify their companies as the source of the pollution, as the source of dental fluorosis, and any other health events that was to occur in the future. That is total speculation. But I ask you to entertain the possibility.
There's so many things wrong with fluoridation. First, it's unethical. You're forcing it on people that don't want it. That violates their informed consent. It's a lousy medical practice. You can't control the dose. You can't control who gets it, and so on. Thirdly, the evidence that it works is very, very weak indeed. Most countries don't do it. Their tooth decay is just as good, if not better, than ours. There are many risks involved. The chemicals that they're using are not pharmaceutical grade. They're a hazardous waste material which hasn't been subjected to thorough toxicological testing. And what's more, it contains all kinds of contaminants from the same phosphate rock that they treat to get this material. It contains lead, it contains arsenic, it contains other toxic metals. It may even contain radioactive isotopes because they mine the same phosphate rock for uranium. If we just focus on one contaminant, arsenic, this means that we are knowingly adding a known carcinogen to the water supply. That's a no-no. The MCLG for arsenic is 0. The safe level for arsenic is 0. So we shouldn't be adding any arsenic to the water supply, but that inevitably happens if you're using a hazardous waste product. In the immediate term, we need to stop this nonsense of marketing fluoridated water, nursery water for babies, when it cannot do them any good at all, and it can only do them harm. Secondly, we need to get a warning to parents in their water bills not to use fluoridated tap water to make up formula, possibly also through the WIC program, because people living in apartments may not get a water bill. It may go to the landlord. So we need to get it to the health clinics and the WIC program. And finally, we need to demand a scientific response to our scientific arguments, and let's give them a year. If there has not been a scientific response, a thorough scientific response to this book within a year, that must be the signal for an overall demand from everybody. Not just us, but everybody should be demanding an end to this most foolish of practices, which to me is the biggest betrayal of the public trust of anything that we did in the 20th century. It's an anomaly that it continues into the 21st century.
Visit Infowars.com and PrisonPlanet.com. When you're on the site, you can also tune in 24 hours a day to my daily radio broadcast. There's also a free iPhone app to listen to the syndicated radio show when and where you want.